Hello, everyone, and welcome back. Today, I'd like to talk about a specific type of dating and relationship advice aimed at women that aims to teach us, supposedly, how to become less male centered while actually remaining still obsessively male centered at its core. It's content that tells women to stop centering men, but the ultimate measure of whether they've done that correctly is still how a man responds to you. In dating coach language, that can often look like don't chase, have boundaries, know your worth, become more secure within yourself, lean into your femininity, be less available. All supposedly for yourself, but so often followed by some version of how doing those things will make a man pursue you. So, does he pursue you? Does he respect you? Does he commit? Does he treat you better? So, the man is supposedly no longer the center of your life while somehow still being the final judge of whether your self development worked. And one common example a lot of coaches like to use is Carrie's and Big's characters from Sex and the City. Many of us have seen the show, and even 20 years on after the final episode, it still gives us plenty of examples of badly handled emotionally dynamics. However, so much of the conversation around their relationship has become less about how Big behaved and more about everything Carrie should have done differently to prevent him from behaving that way. A lot of modern relationship and self-development content seems far more interested in teaching women how they could have prevented the man's bad behavior than asking the man to account for it. Saying that Carrie could have handled that relationship differently for her own sake is one thing, and not wrong, by the way. However, a lot of it sounds more like Big behaved the way he did because Carrie didn't know how to handle him, and that is just wrong. Because yes, Carrie could be completely unhinged around that man. I think we've all seen it. She was anxious, obsessive, jealous at times. She ignored things that she didn't want to see. She wanted reassurance from someone who repeatedly showed her that reassurance was not something he was particularly good at. She kept hoping that the relationship would eventually become, what she wanted instead of looking at what was actually in front of her. And she could have saved herself a lot of suffering by walking away earlier. Ultimately, none of that makes her responsible for Big's behavior. And that's the distinction that I think gets lost. There's a difference between asking, what could Carrie have done differently to protect herself, and what should Carrie have done differently so Big would have treated her better? The first question is about Carrie taking responsibility for Carrie. The second one makes Carrie responsible for Big as well. And when you listen to some of the commentary around their relationship now, there's almost this idea that Carrie failed to understand how to behave around a man like Big. She chased him when she should have pulled back. She wanted too much reassurance, supposedly. She showed him how invested she was. And maybe some of those things did make the dynamic worse. But there's a very subtle shift happening when we start treating those things as explanations for his behavior. Because suddenly, the lesson isn't simply, oh, don't stay in relationships that make you miserable. It's, if you behave correctly, men won't treat you like this. One of the messages that this kind of content indirectly pushes is that you teach people how to treat you. And I'm not 100% supportive of that. If someone consistently treats you badly, you can decide that they no longer get access to you. You can leave. You can stop participating. And in that scenario, they don't get to treat you anyway because they will no longer be in your life. And I think we've stretched the idea of you teach someone how to treat you so far that sometimes it becomes if someone keeps treating you badly, it's because you haven't taught them properly. If you'd had better boundaries, he would have respected you. If you'd valued yourself more, he would have valued you more. If you'd walked away sooner, he would have realized what he was losing. And again, all of it leads back to his response. Even leaving him somehow becomes the strategy for getting him to behave differently. But your boundaries determine what you are willing to participate. They don't determine someone else's character. If a man lies to you, you can leave him. Staying too long isn't what made him a liar. If a man refuses to give you clarity, you can decide that isn't good enough for you. Your failure to leave immediately doesn't suddenly make the confusion entirely your creation. So, having said that, Carrie absolutely had responsibility for continuing to participate in a relationship that repeatedly made her unhappy. However, Big also knew what Carrie wanted. That's the part that I think gets conveniently forgotten. Um, he knew that she was attached to him and that she wanted a committed relationship. He knew that she wanted more from him than what he was willing or able to give at various points throughout their relationship. And yet he didn't exactly make a clean break either. and permanently, remove himself from her life. Instead, he kept going back. She was so obviously a woman who wanted something from him that he couldn't give. He was also capable of saying, I cannot give you this, so I'm going to leave you alone. It's that simple. And I think that's what disappears in the content that criticizes and shames Carrie. When all of our attention goes towards how she should have behaved to be the right woman for a man that was also wrong in many, many ways. But hey, let us, as women, tear another woman down because that's easier than holding a man accountable or responsible for anything. The irony of it. Then we have Natasha's character, because Natasha has almost become the answer to Carrie. Um, Carrie's chaotic, Natasha is composed. Carrie is emotional, Natasha is restrained. Carrie chases big, Natasha appears much more detached. Carrie is messy, expressive, demanding, and insecure. Natasha is supposedly elegant, polished, and understated. And because Natasha embodies so much of what is currently fashionable in femininity content, that quiet luxury, old money, effortlessly composed look, I think people can start treating the aesthetic itself as evidence that Natasha simply knew how to deal with men better, which isn't entirely correct. So she's the kind of woman that Big marries, Carrie isn't. And that's very close to the logic behind a lot of this dating advice. Carrie didn't know her value, Natasha did, supposedly. Carrie chased, Natasha didn't. Carrie was desperate to be chosen, Natasha simply expected to be. So, therefore, Big treated Natasha differently, except Big cheats on Natasha with Carrie, which rather ruins the theory. Because if Carrie represents everything a woman shouldn't do, and Natasha represents everything she supposedly should do, why didn't Natasha's behavior produce a better man? She got the commitment Carrie wanted, she got the marriage, and Big still behaved badly. And I think that's one of the most interesting things about that storyline because Carrie herself falls into exactly the same trap that we're falling into now. She looks at Natasha and thinks, what does she have that I don't? Why her? What is it about this woman that made Big willing to give her something that he couldn't give me? Carrie assumes Natasha must have something that she lacks. And decades later, we're still comparing them. We're still looking for the difference between the women to explain the behavior of the man. If Carrie was supposedly the wrong kind of woman and Natasha was supposedly the right kind of woman, and he still managed to hurt both of them, perhaps the women weren't the variable we should have been studying. Because I also dislike the way Natasha gets turned into another standard women are supposed to live up to. We don't actually need to rank the women at all. No coaching or dating content out there should ever be doing that. And then we have Charlotte, whose character is also used in this type of content to show us what's supposedly right. She's traditional, polished, and marriage minded. She has standards and knows what she wants. And aesthetically, she fits much more comfortably into what a lot of today's femininity content considers to be aspirational. However, Charlotte is also incredibly male centered. She's just male centered in a way that looks much more respectable. Um, Carrie builds a huge amount of her emotional life around romantic obsession. Charlotte does the same thing, but around marriage, around finding a husband. Carrie is losing her mind over Big, while Charlotte has practically turned finding the correct husband, the best the right husband, into a project. They're both placing enormous importance on being chosen by a man. They just happen to perform it differently. And that's why I don't really like turning Charlotte into the sensible woman and Carrie into the cautionary tale. Because then we've created another hierarchy. Be this kind of woman, not that kind. Be Charlotte, not Carrie. Be Natasha, not Carrie. Be the woman men marry, not the woman men mess around with. Because it makes it all about the man again. We're supposedly discussing women's empowerment, and somehow we keep ending up back at the same question: which kind of woman gets the best response from men? That's why I think so much of this content is still male centered, even when it explicitly tells women not to be, because it hasn't removed male approval as the goal. And this is where I think the distinction really matters. I'm absolutely not saying women shouldn't take responsibility for themselves in relationships. Of course, we should. If someone repeatedly shows you that they cannot give you the relationship you want, believe them, and you'll have to leave. In fact, I'd advise it. Um, there's plenty of things that Carrie could have done differently. We shouldn't be turning those things into techniques for producing better behavior from a man, because then we haven't actually stopped centering men at all. We just made women responsible for managing them more efficiently. And I think women end up carrying an impossible amount of responsibility under that model. Women are allowed to make bad romantic decisions without becoming responsible for someone else's bad behavior. Sorry, it's that simple. A man's good behavior is not something a woman unlocks by performing womanhood correctly. Because another person's behavior is not something you control. You control what you participate in and what you accept. That's it. It's that simple. And maybe if we're serious about teaching women to stop centering men, we should actually stop measuring women's growth by what men do in response to it. And perhaps instead of constantly asking what Carrie should have, done to get a different version of big, we should have been asking a much simpler question: what could Carrie have done differently for Carrie, and what should have Big done differently because Big was responsible for himself? This is why any creator branded as coach, who compares those women, and putting the likes of Natasha or Charlotte as the blueprint, is not to be listened to, like, ever. They aim to keep you as male centered as the rest, just using a different lens. You continue to be performative for the approval of another human being. They're not teaching you to stop centering men, they're teaching you a different way to center them.